Welcome to Polaris Live. This is Sarwar Kashmeri inviting our viewers from around the world to this series of programs on the United States and China in the world. This program is brought to you live in conjunction with the Foreign Policy Association in New York. 1 week ago, Chinese leader Xi Jinping attended a pair of summits with Arab leaders. The China Gulf Summit was followed by a meeting between Mr. Xi and the broader 22-member League of Arab States. President Xi Jinping's warm welcome by his host, Saudi de facto leader Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, was in stark contrast to the cold and austere reception of U.S. President a month prior to the Chinese leader's visit. A stark reminder, perhaps, that the 90-year-old U.S. Saudi relationship, as they say in America, ain't what it used to be. Or is that really the case? So, what are the strategic signals being transmitted to the world by this contrasting reception to the leaders of the world's two superpowers? Is it just a replay of the old axiom that countries have no permanent friends, only permanent interests? There's a lot to unpack in this special program of Polaris Live, and we pose these questions to three experts from China, the Middle East, and the United States. So let me introduce our panel today. Professor Zha Daojiong from the School of International Studies, Peking University, is an expert in Chinese energy policies, food and water security in Asia. Dr. Zha is active consulting with Chinese government agencies, having been invited to join the Board of Counselors of the Chinese People's Association for Friendship with Foreign Countries, both under the administration of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. Shaojin Chai, the widely published professor from the Department of International Relations, University of Sharjah, UAE. He was previously a research fellow and advisor to Ministry of Culture, Knowledge Development, and Instructor of Global Studies at Zayed University, Dubai, United Arab Emirates. And last but not least, Ryan Haas is a senior fellow and the Michael H. Armacost Chair in the Foreign Policy Program at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., where he holds a joint appointment to the John L. Thornton China Center and Center for East Asia Policy Studies. Haas has served as Director for China, Taiwan, and Mongolia at the White House, National Security Council staff, and advised President Obama and senior White House officials on U.S. policy towards China, Taiwan, Mongolia, and coordinated the implementation of the U.S. policy towards this region. What I will do now is let each one of our skilled guests have an opening statement. And at the end of that, we will get into our question and answer session, and we'll proceed in that way. So let me start with Professor Zha Daojiong, then Shaojin Chai, and then Ryan Haas. So Professor Zha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. Um, I would probably have four sentences to say just as a startup. The first sentence is that it's a bit of a surprise to many of us here that this trip by President Xi to the Middle East is seen as a quote unquote loss or a challenge to U.S. However you characterize it, U.S. role or U.S. predominance or U.S. influence in the Middle East. Why? Because you have a long history of U.S. involvement in the Middle East. It goes way beyond just oil and other facets of economics. Uh, China has a societal connection with the Middle East, mainly in terms of culture or religion, but if China is no quote unquote match in terms of impact or impact through actions on the ground in the Middle East. That's what I would say first sentence. And second sentence is that if you look at the actual planning of the trip, you look at some of the news reports, at least there were 4 different dates given for this year. And the fact they took place only in December toward the end of the year, I would speculate that the hosts in the Middle East were taking time to coordinate what they were going to offer in terms of, you have a number of agreements. I think those agreements negotiation took much longer time than was normally expected. In other words, beyond the public show of warm receptions, the actual negotiations between China and the Middle Eastern countries, including that with Saudi Arabia, actually went through a process of back and forth. We shouldn't be taken away just by, for example, the escort of the fighter jets of Saudi Arabia or the niceties that are put on public display. The third observation is that structurally, we are going to hear more probably from Professor Chai. China and the Middle East have tried to establish trade and investment networks with each other, going back to the so-called Dragon Mart arrangement in Dubai in 2004. And then here in China itself, Ningxia, China established the China Arab Trade Expo that in 2013. Ningxia being inland China, we say the actual dynamics is quite limited. But then I would read the trip as part of a continuation of the Chinese efforts to be part of the economic diversification of Middle Eastern economies. And certainly there is a reciprocal dimension to the Middle Eastern economies should be participating more in the Chinese economy. The last point is that it's a bit of curiosity or mystery how and why the China Gulf Cooperation Council, the China GCC Free Trade Area Arrangement, it has been almost 20 years in the negotiations, in the running. It was not highlighted on this trip. After all, if relationships, even when you limit that to economic relationships, have to constantly be boosted to high-level visits and visible visits, rather than relying on structural arrangements such as free trade arrangement or mutual bilateral investment treaties. Those relationships are actually quite fragile. Let me put it that way. There's a lot more work to do on the road. But in general, I'm a little surprised how and why this caught so much interest in the U.S.
Dr. Shaojin?
Thank you for having me, and great to see the Professor Zha and Dr. Ryan to join us in this wonderful panel. As a columnist in the Middle East, and I have also opportunity to be in Riyadh last week when the summit was happening. So I will just tell a bit of my observation and my analysis about this visit, and then we will see if I can contribute to any understanding of this visit and the relationship. So this, as Sarwar just mentioned in the beginning, the reception and the pop-ups for his visit, President Xi's visit in Saudi Arabia, and even the media and the general public reception, it seems much has a lot of expectation of warmth. When I was in Riyadh, you see all this decoration with Chinese flag and the announcement of all the about this summit, and all the media were all gathered in the few hotels around the summit to report about this. Even I did some like random street interviews with Saudi citizens. I talked to, do you know about this visit? Do you know Chinese are coming? Are you afraid of this? So I was just like making jokes like that. And yes, they said okay. Most of them said yes, they know. Especially I think the ordinary citizens. They said because they were bombarded by this news and the media, and also there is big blockade on the street of the Riyadh. So like for one staff from Starbucks, he told me, oh, normally it takes 15 minutes for me to get to work. Now it took me 3 hours. So it was like same the big thing, you know. Not only about Chinese president, there's a head of states or head of government from 22 Arab states also coming. And the Saudi elites, when I met a few professors from King Saudi University, I also talked with them. That's like, what do they think about this visit and the future relationship? They said, yes, they have a huge expectation. This is the most important event since the founding of their kingdom, we can say. And if so, I read this very great complimentary as because when they see I'm a Chinese, I'm a guest there. Maybe they just want to make me happy. But I think it's like symbolically talking. It is a very big thing, you know. Even for Chinese media, they call it like a three rings meeting, you know, because you have Chinese Saudi Arabia summit, China GCC summit, and China Arab State summit. So all these three summits, like as I said, when I said symbolic, because it's send a very strong message, either to the people inside or outside of the region, and even politically, it's significant in that for the first time, the GCC or Arab state has openly and confidently say, okay, we are the ones who want to choose China as our strategic partner or strategic one of the strategic partner at least, you know. So the statement they published after the summits, you know, it was interesting to see that China had joined GCC or Arab states in many of the political stance. So, for example, the three islands between UAE and Iran was mentioned. This dispute between UAE and Iran was mentioned in the joint statement. Because as you can recall, China always take a very non-interventionist, you know, equal distance diplomacy with all the states in the region. But now it is rare, you know, it is surprising to see the kind of, at least jointly issued this statement about this territorial dispute. Another issue, China made a big, strong support of solidarity with the Palestinians. So before, I think, as I read it, it was Chinese always okay. Let's solve it within the international law, international treaties, and within the framework of the United Nations. That's Chinese. I think that still holds. Still didn't change today, but it was interesting or surprising to see Chinese there say, hey, we all stand together with Arabs in this issue, you know, with Arab state. So it was like very strong symbolically and politically. And besides that, I think later on we can talk about like a more substantive, real stuff, like economic, trade, the deal they signed, 35 deal was signed there, and the future trajectories. But in like sum up, this general observation is like this meeting is much more like in terms of symbolic, politically important. You know, it made a big news and big PR for both sides.
Thank you, Dr. Haas.
Well, Sarwar, it's really a pleasure for me to appear alongside you and with Zha Daojiong and Dr. Chai. I have to admit two things at the outset. The first of which is that if anyone is tuning in to hear a cage match, argument between us, I think they'll be disappointed because I don't have any big quarrels to pick over the visit. And the second is that I'm primarily interested in hearing from our Chinese friends. Given the lack of travel between our two countries, it's unfortunate that we've had so little communication between our two sides. So it's valuable for us to hear Chinese perspectives on President Xi's recent trip to Saudi Arabia. I'll offer a perspective from where I sit in Washington, D.C., which may complement and perhaps contrast with some of the things that we've heard. First of all, I tip my hat to China's diplomats for a well-timed, well-executed visit by President Xi to Saudi Arabia. I thought the optics of it were impressive, but I wouldn't go so far as to view the visit as transformational or epochal in nature. I saw it as sort of a natural next step in the continuing deepening of China's relationships with countries in the Middle East. And I think it's important to put this visit in historical context. We can go back to 138 BC to the first voyage by Chinese if we want, but I go back to the early 1990s because from that point until now, China has been on a trajectory of steadily deepening its relationships in the Middle East, largely driven at first by China's growing oil demand as its economy grew. But in the decades since, this has expanded. China is now investing in long-term capital-intensive projects across the region. But with the exception of its small outpost in Djibouti, China really doesn't have any meaningful military presence in the Middle East. Beijing basically continues to rely upon the United States to be the security guarantor in the Middle East, to preserve open access to sea lanes into and out of the Middle East. And while there are some analysts who would like to frame President Xi's recent visit to Saudi Arabia as a zero-sum competition for influence, I don't think that idea has much purchase in the United States, or at least in Washington, D.C., because when you step back and reflect upon America's and China's respective interests in the Middle East, they really are not in significant tension with each other. As long as China doesn't seek to limit America's influence or access in the region, or its traditional national security role, both our countries really don't have any vital interests that are in conflict with each other in the Middle East. Both the United States and China demand peace and stability in the Middle East, and they both seek a reduction of tensions and threats emanating from the Middle East. And I think that this understanding of our respective interests in the Middle East informs the more measured reaction from the United States to President Xi's visit to Saudi Arabia.
Thank you for that, Mr. Haas. I wanted to, if I may, excuse me, I wanted to just push back a bit on what you've just said. While I totally agree with almost all of it, and it's heartening to hear that there is a place in the world where American and Chinese interests come together in the Middle East, because that really is a big thing that should be pointed out. But let me inject the war between Russia and Ukraine into what you've just said. Isn't it a policy position of the United States and the West, in fact, that, hey, listen, you're either with us or not with us when it comes to Ukraine? You've got to believe that this is democracy versus autocracy. Isn't that a fault line that cannot be bridged at this point?
Well, the United States certainly would like as many countries as possible to share its view of Russia's barbarism in Ukraine. And it really is barbarism. If you look at the totality of evidence of what's going on, the United States would like countries not to be neutral in the face of violations of territorial integrity. The United States would like countries to uphold the principles upon which the United Nations was founded. But the United States also has a certain degree of flexibility in its foreign policy. Many of our close friends, including India, I would suggest, have a different view and see their interest as being advanced by taking a more neutral position on some of these questions. So I don't consider these countries in the Middle East's views on Russia's invasion of Ukraine as determinative of the overall direction of the relationship. it's one of many issues upon which the relationship rests.
And so let me ask Professor Daojiong Zha and also Chai Shaojin, do you agree with this? It sounds almost as though Ukraine doesn't really matter as much as I had thought in international relations, especially with China. What do you think?
Well, the issue of territorial integrity is a shared value. China, other countries on the UN system, there is no question about that. But then, here in China, we keep reminding others of that value in terms of dealing with Taiwan, and other matters. But when it comes to Ukraine, that principle is there. But then, as you know, universal principles require specific entities, actors to implement. But between Russia and the Ukraine, there's a long and a complex history. How and why they came to such direct conflict again? Last time was 2014. The reaction from the rest of the world was quite brief and not really that sharp. So many of us were actually surprised. But in any case, it really takes the two direct parties in this conflict to resolve this. And that's what I would say. So, the Ukraine situation features in the in the interaction between China and Saudi Arabia or other countries in the Middle East, that's a bit of a myth to us.
Hmm.
Why is that? What's the connection?
So, Dr. Chai, what do you think? Do you think that this is an issue that is inconsequential as far as China-Middle East relations go? Ukraine.
You're right. I agree with Professor Zha that this Ukraine thing, Russia-Ukraine conflict, is not really a top priority in the agenda of the two sides of discussion during the summits. Maybe it's serve as a backdrop. So one of the the increasing tension and geopolitical conflict of the world, which push China and the Middle Eastern countries, especially Arab countries, to together to work out something. On a side note, I think in Middle Eastern countries, like they have been seeing this, the claims about territorial integrity, and sovereignty, etc., etc. But they saw the countries around them, like Palestine, like Iraq, like Afghanistan. So all this war happened there, conflict happened there. They thought, okay, what difference with Ukraine? This another great power invading or getting there, and like the American did with our two neighbors here. So that didn't this thing does not really play well here. And unless I think I heard some, many scholars they're accusing that okay, there's double standards coming here. So I think that's what general sentiment here. Secondly, there's this issue with oil. I think both Professor Zha and Ryan are expert on this regard. So in terms of they have an interest of keeping the oil price in a stable and even high stage. Even in the citizens here, in the GCC countries, I've talked to them. Now they believe this is the last chance. They call it last oil boom. They have make as much money as possible, sell as much oil as possible for this time. They will never see this price this high. So they, of course, based on this interest, I think the leaders, they will take the stance to, not ally with Russia, but to use this opportunity to, get as much economic interest from oil as possible. In fact, on the day of Xi's visit, there was a small news, but they make a big deal out of it. UAE and Saudi, I think UAE is mainly taking the lead. They negotiate a prisoner swap between USA and Russia. And it was it's happening at Abu Dhabi airport. Listen, see, we are doing this for both powers. We are doing being neutral. We are being, being balancing here. It was like when China is here and US said we are balancing USA and Russia. It was very interesting to see this.
Yeah, that's
Sarwar,
please.
Can I just add one thought that
absolutely.
I just want to make sure that I'm clear on this point. I think that the events in Ukraine are significant, and if I were to be candid about it, I think that China has been perhaps one of the greatest losers in the international system of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. China is the world's largest oil importer. The Saudis and others in the Middle East have an interest in high oil prices for the reasons that Dr. Chai just mentioned. China, as the world's largest purchaser of oil, has an interest in low oil prices. So Russia's invasion of Ukraine has had a detrimental effect on China's interests. I think China also has suffered significantly in its influence in Europe. Europe is in the midst of the largest land war since World War II, and rightly or wrongly, fairly or unfairly, China is perceived as providing rhetorical, at least, support for Russia's actions in Ukraine. And if you look at polling around the world, at least in the developed world, it's not coincidental that China's image is at or near the worst that it's been since 1989 at this moment, because of the association between China's support for Russia's actions in Ukraine. The events in Ukraine also cast an uncomfortable light on Taiwan as an issue, and it's raised a lot of questions around the world of whether Ukraine today reflects Taiwan tomorrow. And it's led to a real increase in awareness and focus around the world on the importance of Taiwan in the international system, and also in the international economy in ways that are not conducive to China's long-term ambitions and goals. And then there's the issue of the support for core principles upon which the international system rests, upon which the United Nations is built, and China's equivocation on the issue of territorial integrity has really challenged the notion of it as a long-term principled actor in this regard. So I just want to make clear, Sarwar, for the conversation that I'm not neutral on this issue, and I think that Russia has done a tremendous disservice to China's long-term strategic interests.
Thank you. I want to turn it over to Daojiong Zha, because I know I don't, but I just noticed some questions coming up. So I want to remind the audience that the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen can be used to ask questions of our audience. We are live with the chat box, and of course, we'll take as many of them as time permits. And so let me give Professor Zha a chance to respond to Mr. Haas, and I'm particularly interested in hearing whether you agree with this, with the idea that he mentioned that China's image is at a low point. If I'm paraphrasing, please go ahead.
Well, Ryan has a point. Nevertheless, I will say probably make two points. One is that there was a bit of railroading, or China being railroaded into a quote-unquote show of solidarity with Russia right before the invasion or the movement into Ukraine. Look, the Beijing Olympics, right? China made an effort. All countries do these sport events as part of public diplomacy. We would have as many countries as represented. There was an effective boycott by the G7 or whatnot. And Mr. Putin came here. There was a long document signed. And then, and then of course, domestically, we had a high-ranking government official in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs who was too much of a loose cannon. Later on, he was demoted very forcefully. That to us is a self-correction. That's one statement. We did not really handle this, but there was a bit of China being railroaded into, um, siding with Russia. You have, it makes a difference. If Russia, a permanent UN permanent five member head of state coming to the Olympics, or just someone from the Republic of Palau, that makes a big difference for any country that hosts it. And then, like I said, we had so-called wolf warrior diplomacy, including that by one of the deputy foreign ministers who was very thoroughly demoted. And that's a strong message to the bureaucracy and to the rest of the country that China does not wish to go, that does not support Russia along the lines of so-called no-limit relationship. And secondly, with regard to energy and other um, dimensions of the China-Russia relationship, it would be very interesting to compare, in tonnage terms, how much oil Russia sells to China before and after the February 24th, to Europe and to China. And then there are also economic geographies here at work. For example, gas. The Russian gas fields normally going to Europe don't come to those gas produced in those fields cannot come to China simply because you don't have a pipeline. And then when you look at Chinese investments in the Russian upstream, those were strictly limited to a number of projects that supply China. But this is very different from European and even American companies that are involved in the gas and oil production in the Russian fields. Or even for that matter, you look at Sakhalin, which is geographically so close to China, right? You have Japanese government investment, Indian investment, not Chinese. So a lot of times, Ryan had a good point earlier on that partly due to COVID, the travel restrictions, but more seriously, I would think over the years, there is a tendency, both here in China and over there in Washington, D.C., to be sure, research folks, and I hope it's not diplomats, do a better job than that. The researchers, they pick certain words, and those vocabularies come through translation, and sometimes, very badly or poorly translated, and then they start to expand with the discussion. You have the usual reminder of the forest and the tree is quite important here. The last quick, just if I add something more, is that price is one factor in terms of oil and gas exchange. But when you think about long-term economic relationships between a purchasing party and a selling party, it's the predictability of supply and demand, the virtual long-term contracts, and price is a secondary issue. In other words, we can bring in the topics of sanctions that may intervene in that predictability of trade relationship. That certainly applies to China and Saudi Arabia and other oil and gas suppliers in the Middle East. If anything, shortly before President Xi's trip, I believe, China signed a long-term gas LNG agreement with the UAE, and the price is not really that low. But why you sign it is the long duration of it. Or in political terms, the trust that matters. The U.S. would not sign that kind of agreement with China, would it?
So,
even if we double the price.
Ryan, I hear a question here directly to you, so I'll give you a chance to respond if you'd like, and then Shaojin, I'll let you respond to this exchange. So please, Ryan, if you want to.
Well, I'm not sure what the question is. I guess I acknowledge Zha Daojiong's point. I think it's a good and fair point that predictability of long-term access is an important consideration. And if I were in Beijing, I would also be looking for opportunities to lock in long-term access to resources that I know China will need going forward. So according to China's interest, I think it makes perfect sense.
And Shaojin Chai, your response to this exchange?
Yeah, the long-term predictability or the long-term stable supply is much more important than short-term gains. And actually, in the past few months, China benefited by buying a lot of discounted Russian oil, but still President Xi Jinping and Chinese as in general, they want to guarantee like long-term stable energy security from GCC countries. Like Saudi actually supplies almost 20% Chinese oil, and you have UAE, you have Oman, and Qatar supplying LNG. So all this makes China put great weight in this region to guarantee its energy security, not only about supply, but also to make the maritime security, the sea lines will make sure that will not be disrupted. You know, all this is into the consideration and was discussed during the summit.
Okay, I wanted to see if Professor Zha can hear me. Daojiong, you've gone off. Your video has stopped transmitting. Perhaps something is happening on your side. Can you try and get yourself back into the conversation? And while that is happening, I wanted to change topics a bit and ask. Thank you. You're perfect. And I wanted to just direct a question to Professor Haas, actually. And this is an American ambassador, former ambassador to the region, who made a statement that is something like the U.S. Saudi relationship. We should not be surprised at the reception that the two presidents received. And he characterized the relationship as a slow moving train wreck. This is a former ambassador to the region. And we shouldn't be surprised to see the consequences of that, said this former U.S. ambassador to Saudi Arabia. Do you agree with that?
Well, I'm not an expert on the Middle East, so I will offer a response, but with a high degree of modesty, Sarwar.
Of course. Modesty from you is well recognized.
And my view is that the United States is an energy superpower. We are not in the same position as China. China is the world's largest purchaser of foreign oil. It doesn't have the capacity to generate enough supply to meet its demand. And China is working to diversify its energy supplies. It's building pipelines. It's trying to work on fracking and shale. It is accelerating the development of renewable energy sources, and it's the largest generator of renewable energy in the world. So China recognizes that its overdependence, its overweighting on oil from the Middle East is a problem, a long-term strategic problem, point of vulnerability. It's not necessarily a vulnerability that the United States shares. We're no longer as dependent upon the Saudis as we were in previous decades. Now, of course, there's a global energy market, so we are affected if the price of oil goes up, just like every other country. But we are in a fundamentally different position than the Chinese are. And that's why I think it's a bit superficial to consider President Xi's trip to Saudi Arabia as some sort of zero-sum dynamic. What I focus on mostly, Sarwar, is Chinese foreign policy. And what I see as I look at China's approach to the Middle East is a pretty narrow definition of how China identifies its vital interest in the Middle East. There really, I think, are two or three components. First, they want to preserve unimpeded access to energy and markets in the Middle East. Second, they want to protect Chinese citizens in the Middle East. And there's a significant number. I think there are somewhere around 500,000, and that number continues to grow. And then third, I think they want to avoid entanglements in the Middle East that could cast a negative light on China in the Muslim world. And as long as China continues to define its interests along these very narrow lines in the Middle East, as I said at the outset, I don't think that U.S. and Chinese vital interests in the Middle East will be in significant conflict with each other.
Okay. Any response from that from either Daojiong or Chai?
Well, in addition to what Ryan said, the Chinese interest in the Middle East region, um, you have oil, energy, you have Chinese civilians, or the, let's say, religious factor. We don't. That's very clearly stated. The Middle East, or for that matter, the religion, or extending all the way to Afghanistan and a part of Pakistan. We don't want this to be a source of instability here inside China. How you do that? That's the third element, whereas the so-called Belt and Road put under that big umbrella. That we want the Middle East to really diversify the economies, to increase indigenous capacity in terms of technology, in terms of to whatever extent possible manufacturing or even desert agriculture. So long as you have the Middle Eastern economy that's so concentrated in natural resources alone, and mind you, many of those natural resources production process um, through foreign um, technology, foreign equipment, and higher labor, the society of the Middle East will remain volatile. So for China to invest in infrastructure projects, invest in alternative energy, invest in joint research on anything, that that diversification of the uh, economy in the Middle East is in the fundamental interest of China. As for the military dimension, no, you have to put in context the connected geography. Should China take any sort of military role in the Middle East, or let's say, quote unquote, take a page from the United States, it's going to backfire on China very badly because the of the population, because of the sensitivity, the religion, and also very, very, very frankly speaking, we don't, we many of the Han Chinese don't speak any version of Arabic language, and we already had these problems with Xinjiang when messaging um, with even before internet age in non-Han Chinese language is enough of headache for us. No, we don't want to have any. We have no business in any military sense in the Middle East.
So that point is well made. What I want
Let the U.S. handle it. The Americans are good at it. Let the Americans go ahead.
Thank you. The question I have is, everyone seems to be searching for a way to thaw the relationship between America and China. Officials on both sides, it just seems to keep deteriorating. Uh, my question is this. I recently, in this Foreign Policy Association report, suggested we ought to, for a while, turn over the leadership of the relationship rebuilding to the business community and let them take the leadership to improve relations with China. But what I'm asking now, based on what all three of you have said, and I'll direct this to Shaojin Chai, is that as I hear it, the defense parameters in the Middle East, that America and China have basically the same concerns: stability, keep the peace. Might this be yet another way for U.S. and China to rebuild their relationship, to thaw this daggers drawn confrontation that both are on? What do you think, Shogun Chai? Is that an initiative that should be grabbed to better the overall relationship?
Yes, it should be. Uh, both countries, USA and China, has this desire to maintain peace and stability in the region. Now, USA is the major guarantor, security guarantor for the countries in the region. China plays minimal and neglectable role in that supplying a bit of drones, and here and there, not in a systematic way. Although there's a desire from Middle Eastern countries that okay, we want to diversify our arms supply or defense supply a bit. Like they tried with France, yeah, they tried with Russia. Now China maybe because Chinese drones are cheaper and the anti-drone weapons are also cheaper. For Saudis, like if you want to shoot Houthis, drones to bother them, every month, then they cannot afford Patriot missiles for that. Even or as rich as Saudi Arabia. I think there might be this desire, but this is not like cannot be done very short period of time. But the goal is the same. I think the China and the USA could work on this. One note, today I will try to play the role of voicing the regional concerns. So I think after the so many years of conflict, you have Afghanistan, you have Iraq, you have still a war going on in Yemen, and also you have the Arab Spring, revolutionaries, rebellions, civil wars. I think now there's this sense, general public opinion sense in the region that they are fed up with this. They want stability, they want peace, they want development. So if both USA and China can take this opportunity to work out some mechanism or some arrangement to cater for this, public regional sentiment for peace and development and for stability, not war and revolutions. I think that's time definitely past. Or you can also observe, this phenomenon during the World Cup, just happened in Qatar. You see, the Arab voices, Middle East voice, they wanted this way. We want to bring the peace and development back after suffering so many years of conflict. So with this, I think USA has, they provide security, military protection here, and they also provide, I think, good political and norms and international organization arrangement, etc., etc. And China provide economic, infrastructure, and so it's good complementary to at some point, so to both fit the need of the region. So in this case, I mean, the two powers don't need to conflict. They can work to find the common ground to cooperate, and each one doing the ones they are good at. For example, US, they can do the security, defense, and even political ones, and China can do the economic and trade investment side. Right. So I think that's maybe naive, but I think that could be a possibility.
Thank you for that. And I want to tack one more time or focus on the strategic impact of this visit. And Ryan, if it's okay, I'll direct this to you after I finish. President Biden, the papers are reporting, media's reporting today, is making a big push to rebuild America's influence in Africa. There's concern that China has put so much money into it, the BRI, that America may be on the losing side unless we become more active. A wonderful initiative, in my opinion. But let me ask you this. Is there a risk the same kind of damage could be done to American influence in the Middle East? I mean, let me give you just some examples. Here's Saudi Arabia and other kingdoms that are now beginning to require the teaching of Mandarin from a kindergarten levels going on. In Oman and other countries, there is the issuance of renminbi denominated bonds. There is some talk that the recent agreements that were signed last week have something to do with a portion of the payment to be in renminbi. So it sounds as though, to me, to an outside observer that's not an expert like you, that America risks losing the influence battle, if I may call it that, over the long term in the Middle East, as has happened in Africa. What do you think, Ron?
Well, I appreciate your efforts to provoke a response, Sarwar. I guess I'm a little bit less alarmed than your question would suggest.
Okay.
The RMB is not going to displace the United States dollar in my lifetime, unless the United States does something to erode or undermine the credibility of the U.S. dollar. So I think that we can set that concern aside. The fact that Saudi students will study Chinese, I think, is a wonderful thing. That doesn't bother me in the least. If it leads to greater mutual understanding, then the world will be a better place. If China decides that it wants to pour its resources into rebuilding war-torn areas of the Middle East, then the world will be a better place and people's lives there will be improved. if China makes efforts to increase the flow of oil coming out of the Middle East, then that will have a deflationary effect, which will serve American and other interests as well. And so I don't think that there are a lot of issues upon which U.S. and Chinese vital interests are in tension in the Middle East. And the sort of ephemeral notion of influence, I got to say, we've had a strong presence in the Middle East for a long time. I think we should have a pretty high degree of confidence in our continuing influence and presence and impact in the Middle East. And as Dr. Chai and Zha Daojiong said, this isn't a vacuum that the Chinese are clamoring to fill. So I think that we also should keep in context that the nature of the prize that is being chased after here may not be as attractive as some would like to think. On the issue of Africa, look, I think it's great that the United States ups its game, and I hope that the United States and China find themselves in a race to the top rather than a race to the bottom in terms of attracting influence and generating support on the basis of the contributions that they make to addressing the specific concerns of countries and peoples in that region. If that ends up being the case, then again, I think the world will be a better place.
Well, for 2 years, I've tried to have you strike a confrontational tone, which I've not yet succeeded, but I'm going to keep trying. So that brings me to this question, which now, and it's based on what you all have said, that we have unearthed at least 3 different ways, right, Shaojin, where America and China can begin to thaw the break in their relationship. We've talked about defense. Ryan has talked about if both can contribute to rebuilding war-torn areas. That's another. So here are 3 different ways in which we might proceed. What is the primary reason for this daggers drawn approach? Why can we not proceed in a number of different ways to thaw the break in this relationship? And let me start with you, Shaojin, and then Daojiong, and then Ryan Haas. And then after that, I'll give each one of you a chance to make closing arguments. So please go ahead.
Yeah, it's very difficult to answer this question.
Because you agree, right, Shaojin, that this is, a lot of people think, the most consequential relationship in the world this century, the American-Chinese relationship. So please proceed. Sorry to interrupt.
So based on like what like theoretical perspective or even like ideological stance you take, and then you can see why U.S. China has to they have to go this way. As many of claim they are going to new Cold War, or they're going to be a clash, etc., etc. I think we are in the 21st century. The leaders are well informed with all this technological, all this mechanism. So I hope they will not, take the, wrong decisions to make this conflict inevitable. There is a ways to redirect, to reorient the relations. It's not too late yet. So even the Russian, we see what happened to Russia. Maybe that will learn our Chinese leaders. At least I can see that it's not wise to go head on with any of this conflict. With not because of okay, they are being sanctioned. There's this bad consequences for Russia or potentially for China if China do that with China. But it's just there's no gain, no better outcomes in the 21st century to use force, to use this, this military might to achieve your goals. Even, the superpowers like USA tried that in the first 20 years of 10 years of 20th century, Afghanistan, Iraq. I keep bringing this back. It's a lesson to all. I hope China will not, repeat these mistakes. As our American friends will not do the same.
Thank you. So let me ask Daojiong Jia, and then we'll turn over to Ryan Haas.
Well, I think there are two sets of dynamics going on in U.S.-China relationship. One with optics, as in speeches, position papers, think tank pieces. And you put that together, especially in Washington, D.C., you have that China cloud hovering. Every day you wake up, what have we done? Why the Chinese haven't flinched? Why the Chinese haven't softened? Or why the Chinese? Endless questions. And sometimes we have a bit of that here in Beijing. And there is a Chinese um, proverb type of something, the donkey of Guizhou. Probably later you can ask Ryan what that means in Chinese. Um, you despair, and from that desperate, it's many, you come across as being really frustrated, and from that frustration you go to these endless sanctions list. After a while, I think China is going to be probably 99.9% of the American sanction list. And then what next? The Chinese still don't collapse. They still don't crawl on their hands to Washington and say, please forgive us, or we come to your court and let you sentence me. See, that set of dynamics, I think it's coming. I'm not advising the American government. I don't think on the Chinese side we should we should think seriously. And actually, I spoke and I wrote that China should proactively promote greenfield investment in the United States to be part of the job creation and part of the wealth creation in the United States. It's not the mainstream view yet, but I cannot see any other way. The worst thing we can do is to go along, we here in China can do, is to go along with that seeming, you know, one direction that's going on in the United States. We may be sitting around a little bit, let the Americans frustrate themselves for quite some more years, at least the next 2 years, because we don't expect Mr. Biden to climb down his own ladder. But then there is another set of dynamics that has been proven. Right after the Russia-Ukraine action, if you look at the American think tanks, what were they talking about? They were talking sharply that the U.S. should be doing to China exactly what the U.S. was doing to Russia, even without the Chinese move towards Taiwan. Why? It's influence, it's autocracy, it's non-democracy. The U.S. just has to sanction. It has to do that, do what to China what it did to Russia, even without Chinese action. Some of these very sharply worded statements with these think tank pieces are so meticulously translated in Chinese. It created a cloud of saying, let's be prepared. Then came the showdown of sorts over the Pelosi trip to Taiwan. And I do believe that both sides, you have a learning curve. To say the shuffer is showing itself. And do Americans and the Chinese are really prepared for a conflict either over Taiwan or in Taiwan? And I asked the Australians, who seemingly to be beating the drum of saying, let's do Taiwan, let's do China over Taiwan, over that matter, the Japanese. Are they really? And I go back to that the Chinese statement. Let's remind ourselves that sometimes you have the donkey of Guizhou phenomenon, and it's very useful to remind ourselves there's an element of that in each and every political capital. And I don't really despair. I think the Americans or Chinese here, there is really quiet learning. You don't come out and with and quote unquote surrender in rhetoric, but the actual change in sentiment, how you convince yourself, the actual change in action is more substantial and more important.
Thank you, Professor Jia. We won't have time for closing statements from each one of you, but this is
Sorry.
this is such an important part of the conversation. I want to give now, in closing, Ryan Haas a chance to salvage what remains of the think tank world in Washington. After all, he works probably for the most prominent think tank of all. So the fate of our relationship now rests in your hands.
Well, I have to say, as a member of an American think tank, Zha Daojiong, I think you give us more influence than we deserve with your statements. But look, to be candid for a second, Zha Daojiong's comments reflect a real problem. The Chinese don't have any expectation of an improvement in the relationship in the coming years. I think many in the United States similarly don't expect that there is any possibility of improvement in relations in the coming years either, for mirroring reasons. And that's a real challenge for us. But if we just take a step back for a moment and think about the nature of the competition, Sarwar, and I'll be very brief, I don't think that the United States can impose its will on China any more than it has been able to on Cuba. I don't think China is capable of imposing its will on the United States. Neither side is going to defeat the other. We're both going to have to deal with each other for a long time to come. And so then the question becomes, which country will outperform the other? Because I think that that prestige will be derived from performance, and whichever country demonstrates greater capacity to improve the lives of its citizens, create opportunities for its people, and solve problems around the world will enjoy the pull of power in the international system. So that's the essence of the competition over the long term between the United States and China, and may the best country prevail. I think that the United States in the past year has had a strong year. It has invested over $1 trillion in generational investments in clean energy and technology and infrastructure. We've tightened our alliance partnerships with countries around the world. I think Russia has provided a tremendous assist to those efforts because of its invasion in Ukraine. And I think many in the United States feel like we are regaining our footing in our standing and our strength. And so that's where the competition rests, and that's where I think we should keep our eyes focused for our view of the horizon.
Well, thank you for that. We could go on for another hour, but I think we have run out of time. So that let me again, from the bottom of my heart, thank Ryan Haas, Daojiong Zha, and Shaojin Chai for taking the time from your very busy schedules to appear on Polaris Live. And I think this hour is an illustration of how Polaris hopes to contribute to relations between China and America and the world, because we do offer, I believe, one of the very few non-commercial, say what you want within limits platform to people around, experts around the world. So all three of you, we are in your debt for appearing.
Well, thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you for that.
Thank you very much. And with that, then, let me thank our panelists again, even though they're off the screen, for this hugely informative session. And I want to thank our viewers from around the world. Sorry we did not get to the questions. I hope you can join us again for the next episode of Polaris Live. Please consider signing up for the Polaris Live newsletter by going to my website, Kashmeri.com. That's KASHMERI.com. Till we meet again, goodbye.